Okay. So a very warm welcome to everyone who's joined us tonight from near and far, and an especially warm welcome to our 8 panelists this evening, who have also joined us from near and from afar. And I'd like to briefly start out with an introduction of our panelists and our moderator for this evening, and then take a moment just to give us all some context for the panel and reiterate some of the questions that were really at the inception of this panel, a panel that's really been a long time in the making here at Mind and Life Europe. So our moderator this evening will be Gabor Karsai. He's our managing director at Mind and Life Europe, and he's also a very long-standing member of the MLE Association. And I'm just going to present the panelists in the order that they appear on the program for this evening. So we'll start with Amy Cohen Varela, who is the chairperson of the Mind and Life Europe board and has been involved in Mind and Life since its inception. She's also a practicing clinical psychologist specialized in psychodynamic therapy and philosophy with a background in comparative literature from Brown and Columbia Universities. Our second panelist, Andreas Rupsdorff, is a professor in cognition, communication, and culture at the Department of Culture and Society and the Department of Clinical Medicine at Aarhus University in Denmark. He works at the interface between anthropology, cognitive science, and neuroscience, and is equally interested in the workings of the mind and brain and in how cognitive science and brain imaging relate to other scientific and public fields. And our third panelist, Katrin Bastien-Ventura, was originally trained as a biologist in toxicology and pharmacology and has worked as a research engineer at the National Center for Scientific Research, the CNRS in Paris, France. After 10 years of research in the field of cancerology, she taught and managed research projects in the field of sustainable development for both the private and the public sectors, and has recently developed a strategy and development consulting firm for basic research and international cooperation. Our fourth panelist is a New York native, Father Francis Tiso, who holds a doctorate from Columbia University and Union Theological Seminary, where his specialization was in Buddhist studies. His teaching interests include Christian theology, the history of religions, spirituality, ecumenism, and interreligious dialogue. And since 1888, Father Tiso has been a priest of the Diocese of Insernia Venafro in Italy, where he now serves migrant communities. And our fifth panelist is Roshi Joan Halifax, which is well known to many of us. She's a Buddhist teacher, medical anthropologist, and author. And notably, I want to mention here, author of a book of the same name as the panel, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet, which is a beautiful read. So I'd really recommend that to anyone. It was really at the heart of inspiration for our thoughts about this panel. And she's currently the abbot and head teacher of the Upaya Zen Center and was co-founder of the Mind and Life Institute, as well as the Zen Peacemaker Order. She's also well known as a pioneer in the end of life care field, as well as for her work in engaged Buddhism. So thank you for joining us, Roshi. Our sixth panelist is John Dunn, also joining us from the States. He's the Distinguished Chair in Contemplative Humanities at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, where he serves on the core faculty for the Center for Healthy Minds and as the chair of the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. John's work focuses on Buddhist philosophy and contemplative practice, especially in dialogue with cognitive science and psychology. Our seventh panelist is Mariake Van Vugt, who is an assistant professor at the Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Cognitive Engineering at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. Her research focuses on how, when, and why we mind wander, and on the fundamental cognitive operations that underlie meditation and mindfulness. She's also very interested in the interfaces between science, art, especially classical ballet, and contemplation. And last but not least, our eighth panelist is Martijn van Beek, who's an associate professor of anthropology and affiliated with the Interacting Mind Center, both at Aarhus University in Denmark. Having previously spent many years working and conducting research in Ladakh and elsewhere in the Himalayan region, his current research explores the meeting ground between contemplative traditions, especially Buddhism, consciousness research, and modernity. So again, a really, really warm welcome to all of our panelists. And before I pass the baton to Amy and Gabor, I just wanted to read aloud for you the three sets of questions that really framed this panel and really helped us to think about what kind of discussion we might be able to have tonight. And just so that they're fresh in our ears. So the first set of questions starts out with this. As we embark on a new year, which also happens to be another pandemic year, how do we understand standing at the edge and edge states? How can we apply our different disciplinary lenses to the particular themes in which times in which we're living? And are these times especially edgy times? And for whom? That's another question we had. Second set of questions, how can we stand at the edge, both as individuals and as a collective body, in a way that is productive and expansive, rather than fear-driven and reductive? And finally, the third set of questions has very much to do with the work that we do at MLE and the work that all of our panelists do. Is there work to be done in the coming year that will allow us to better define the edges of our interdisciplinary work at MLE? How can the theoretical work we do make for a better world in a practical sense? And finally, perhaps most importantly, what are some of the questions that would help us to more clearly define the emerging field of contemplative science? So with that, I'm glad to pass the baton to Amy and Gabor, who will start us out with the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Joanna, for that great introduction. And I also wanted to welcome everyone who's watching us online and welcome this beautiful panel and give particular thanks to the team at Mind and Life Europe, including Joanna, Derek Sola, and Charlotte Clough, who actually came up with this idea to inaugurate 2022 with a discussion to deepen the work, to look and see how we could deepen our work for 2022. And it's a very welcome idea, I think, to start with this sort of ritual, given particularly the fact that we're so distributed and virtual these days that we're rarely together. So thank you to the team for having this wonderful idea. I'm going to get us started right away, Gabor, if that's okay with you, or would you like to say something?
Thank you, Amy. Yes, please start with the first question.
So I'd like to start just with a brief quote from the phenomenologist Edward Casey, who wrote a book exclusively on the topic of edges, which he calls a periphenomenology. And in this periphenomenology, he writes, edges are constitutive not only of what we perceive, but also of what we think and of the places and events in which we are situated. Edges do much more than demarcate or delimit spatial spread or temporal extent, being a formative force of their own. Edges, though, he says, are formative for shaping reality, even decisive. He goes on to say, the role of edges is central to the drama of experience, central to the drama of human experience at every level, perceptual, practical, cognitive, aesthetic, emotional, intersubjective. So for Casey, edges are a constitutive element of all our lives on every level. But we also say that we're living these days in edgy times. Now, the word edgy traditionally means tense, apprehensive, unsettled, nervous, but recently it has taken on a positive meaning as well, that of avant-garde or experimental. Edges thus have a dual nature, a bright side and a shadow side. So the first question we have, or topic question for tonight this evening is, given this dual nature of edges, constructive and destructive, disquieting and inspiring, I'd like to go around the panel, before we start a general discussion, go around and ask each one of you, what does standing at the edge mean for you right now, at this moment? Does it have a particular resonance for your daily life? for your field of work and professional existence. How do edges show up in your life and work? So we'd like to do a quick go around with just each panelist sharing some remarks on this topic of edges, constructive and destructive, inspiring and unsettling. Who'd like to start?
Andreas.
Thank you, Amy, for this great introduction. For me, standing at the edge gets a sense of joy and of fear and of trepidation. I think those three of them coming together is what standing at the edge is about for me right now.
For me, I just retired last year from an official position within CNRS, National Center for Scientific Research, and in France. And even if I'm keeping some professional activity, I'm discovering a new space and time in my life. And meanwhile, my daughter gave birth to her first child, who for me was my first grandchild. So I'm definitely entering a new era, which makes me stand at the edge. And I've been thinking and experiencing a lot about this transition, an important step in my life.
Thank you, Katrin. Thank you, Andreas.
If I might jump in, it reminds me so much of the Bardo. It reminds me so much of the idea of a transition, which, in my reading of Milarepa's writings, he says, yes, we talk about the Bardo, of course, of the end of life, but then there's the Bardo, the transitional period, the intermediate state between one thought and another and one event and another. And so at this time, I have this feeling of being in a place where there is a great deal of conflict going on, a great deal of tension. And as a contemplative person also involved in research, trying to find the symbols that enable me to enter into the anthropological reality that we're dealing with today on a social, international level, intercultural level. Almost finding ourselves in a particularly dramatic moment as a planet, almost like the old Puranic myth of the gods against the asuras, coming to the end of an era and experiencing it as a time of conflict and even chaos, in which, as they say, the ocean of milk is stirred up and mysterious poisons arise that were not previously present. And so we have to deal with that. We have to be aware of that. And in some ways, also the actions that drive Roshi Joan's book are about how to use compassion to deal with those poisons, which I think that's very much where I feel that I am right now.
Thank you. Roshi, Joan, perhaps? Something to add there, I imagine.
Thank you, Father Tiso. That's very kind of you. Yeah, I'm very honored to be here and also delighted that you are exploring the subject, not just because it's the name of my book, but I think it's very important for us at this time to explore the benefit and the challenges of being in, Father Tiso, what you call this liminal state, a kind of bardo, betwixt and between. I've described, excuse me, I've described in various talks in the past 2 years since the pandemic started, a perspective of a process that we're in as a culture, as a global culture, from the point of view of being in a rite of passage. And as such, we're in this threshold experience of finding ourselves on this edge between the known and the unknown. And what really interests me is how do we develop the capacity to allow ourselves to open to what Keats spoke to in terms of negative capability, to really rest with openness and not knowing. And it reminds me of a bad joke that Father Tiso, I hope you don't mind. What makes God laugh? Plans. And so, you know, our work, I feel today, in part, is not to develop a plan, but to look at scenarios. Number one, possibilities, knowing that the itinerary is subject to reality. And how do we, as an institution, MLE as an institution, and us as individuals, and also us as a society, develop the quality of mind that allows us to actually rest in not knowing, or in this liminal state where there's intersectionality that is giving rise to species, if you will, that we never imagined.
So if I should add my initial reflections, what I was thinking about initially was how many different dimensions there are to the, potentially to this question of standing at the edge, because we have individual but also collective perspectives on, you know, the world is edgy. People are on edge. The pandemic, growing inequality, tensions in Europe, all sorts of things going on at this global scale. And of course, individually, like the example that Katrin gave, illustrates that it's also very personal kinds of edges that we encounter continuously in our lives. So that also points to the dimension of temporality, whether we have a short-term perspective of these conjunctural, you know, moments of transition, which are happening, as Father Francis said, moment to moment, but also throughout our lives there are these hiccups. And then we have this planetary scale where at least some scientists are telling us that now we live in the Anthropocene, and really a major transition has happened probably already. So so those are some different dimensions at which we could, you know, play with this metaphor, if it is a metaphor. The other aspect that I haven't really mentioned yet is that there is an inner aspect of edges and outer aspects. So we talk about the you know, the fear and anxiety and hopefulness and so on, but there are also outer edges in the existential reality, the material reality that we're encountering. So from all these different angles, we could approach these different questions that arise about edges and edge states and standing at the edge. So anyway, those are just some preliminary thoughts I had.
Thank you, Martijn.
Yeah, I was thinking, following on to the internal versus external perspectives that Martijn just mentioned, the first association I had with edges was me trying to figure out constantly how to be a scientist and a practitioner, and also a scientist and a dancer and a practitioner, and how do all of these things interrelate and can learn from each other. So that's the internal personal perspective, which is at once a constant struggle and challenge, as well as constantly really exciting. And I would also say that within even the research dimension, I'm a chronic interdisciplinary scientist. I just can't do focusing on a single field and topic just for my whole career. which is at once a struggle, but at the same time tremendously exciting and constantly stimulating. So that's that part. But then there's also the times of the edges, and I thought about how at the same time it's an edgy time in the sense of it's very uncertain, like things can change within a few hours. And I think we've all seen that with lockdown suddenly happening and then suddenly dissolving and reappearing, and every country is different. So there's this tremendous uncertainty that at least I'm in the West not so much used to. Where everything is stable and organized most of the time. But at the same time, sometimes it's more difficult to stand at the edge with all the media and special social media, which tends to lock us up in a bubble where you cannot actually see the other side. So that's this weird contradiction almost, that at once we're in this very volatile state, and at the same time, it's very easy to get locked into your own bubble.
I really appreciate everything I've heard here. I just sort of almost want to just sit back and listen. I think many of us are on the same wavelength, but at slightly different frequencies. So this is going to be a great conversation. I suppose, I don't know, sometimes right now as a department chair, I think on the edge that I'm on is on the edge of sanity, frankly. It's like, and people are, we talk about our institutions and even the fragility of our institutions. It's also, of course, of the people in those institutions. And it's been really tough. Those of us who are academics know how hard it has been to, to teach, to work with our students who are extremely anxious. It's been a really tough time. But some of that also, interestingly, I think is, and we all, I think, know this, it's also a matter of how we are looking, how we are seeing. And that I think I really appreciate Martijn's comment. In a sense, there are, of course, circumstances that we're facing right now. Maybe every generation thinks it's on the edge. Maybe we're, not as much on the edge as we think we are. Some of it certainly is how we are seeing it. And in a sense, what is it about us that makes edges? What is it about the way we see the world that makes edges, including the kinds of like echo chambers that we see that Marieke is talking about, the sense in which we can be caught in our bubbles. So I think part of what's really interesting about this time is that on the one hand, yes, we face certain types of what seem to be almost cataclysmic edges. And on the other hand, these are creating, maybe actually some of them are completely illusory, just in the way like a Facebook group is in a certain sense a kind of illusory entity, isn't it? It just exists simply by the force of the minds that create it. So some of these edges, I think, actually may simply dissipate by the way in which we encounter them. And that dissipation, and this I really appreciate Roshi Joan's reference to this kind of sense of liminality. I think of the anthropologist Victor Turner. I think she was almost referring to him probably. That sense in which as you enter into a ritual space, the ritual space in which so much transformation becomes possible, you go through a transition in which, in a sense, the ordinary rules fall apart. And so part of that, and then there's no more edge, right? Because actually, if you're on the edge, literally, well, it's gone because you're in both places at once and neither, right? That kind of a bardo. So that I think is a place where we may be getting to even culturally, perhaps, a certain, I'm very interested in cultural evolution these days. And I'm just wondering whether we are at a point where there's a very important moment of cultural evolution that we're facing, that will involve, in a sense, the evaporation of some of these edges. Well, anyway, we'll see. Hopefully I'll survive as a chair at least.
That's a wonderful question, John. What is it about us that makes us edge makers? Because I think that in effect, this may not be a particularly edgy period, or this may be an edgier period in certain places in the world right now, and not edgier, though, than places that have been living with people who have been living in liminal circumstances on the edge of crisis for decades, if not, constantly. So depending on where we are, I think there's also a question of relative edginess. But that question of who are we edge makers is very interesting, because it also brings us to the second point. I think that the second topic that we wanted to discuss, which is the ubiquity of edges. So, we all seem to agree that edges are ubiquitous. And one of the things that, I might add from an enactive perspective is that edges are necessary. It's not just enactive in the sense of cognitive science, but Francis Tiso spoke of ritual. Edges are necessary for sense making. You need to get to the end of the sentence before you can get back and do the hermeneutic reading of it. And edges are, I think Roshi Joan mentioned in her book, perhaps, and other people have made reference to this in other works that they've done on edges, is from the perspective of dynamical systems theory and from enactive cognitive science. So I'm bringing us sort of back to enaction. The world is made up of edges. That's the definition of the world. Roshi Joan mentioned the word threshold. That's part of dynamical systems theory, that any stability, any constant pattern or any stability is a precursor to change, and any change is followed by a new order of stability that then will be taken down by the next period of change. So whether we like it or not, and whether we understand or not how we make edges, we are really through and through edge beings. So the question or the topic I'd like us to address now is, how can we stand at the edge or live our experience as edge beings? And Martijn brought this up, both as individuals and as a collective body, in a way that is productive and expansive rather than fear-driven and reductive. So maybe someone would like to get started on that. Roshi, perhaps?
Actually, I'm really sitting with the listening of it, but I want to just explore what we mean by edge. In the book, I wrote about edge being a rather sharp threshold, if you will, a delineation between virtue and non-virtue. And I also, in the book, using complex adaptive systems as a kind of model, spoke to the generativity of falling over the edge, of finding ourselves in a state that is dispositive. And that, as I mentioned in the book extensively, that compassion, per how I view compassion, and thank you, John, view is such an important part of how we look at edges, how compassion becomes the medium for actually transforming a negative experience of being in a landscape that is non-generative. So, there's the sharp edge, but then there's another kind of edge. And this Father Tiso spoke to, and also I spoke to, and Martijn, and that is the state of liminality, of this being in a threshold. And there's an interesting ecological perspective on this. It's what's called an ecotone. And this is a zone of junction or transition area between two biomes. For example, a mangrove forest is an ecotone between a marine and a terrestrial ecosystem. And there are particular species that find themselves in this borderland area. Sometimes there's fewer species, sometimes there are more species. But I think it's a very interesting image for us to explore is, when we're in this liminal state, when we're in this territory between geographies, which is a kind of zone of tension. We're in this state of conditions which are characterized by being intermediate. What are the possibilities for us as we rest, in this territory of liminality, of in betweenness, to go back to what Father Tiso said. And I think one of the things that is really interesting for us to explore is our aversion or fear of being in this liminal state and what that produces and how we can create the conditions where people are in fact not necessarily completely discombobulated, but use the state of liminality as a means for actually strengthening resilience, character, capacity. So those are just some thoughts that come to mind. These two different kinds of edges. One is, which is a clear demarcation over which if you step, you end up in a toxic landscape and then can, use various ways to transform your experience of toxicity. Or there's this intermediate territory, which has many surprises to it, including new species. And are we willing to rest in that kind of indeterminacy? That is a question I think is really important for us to explore. How do we actually approach reality when we suddenly realize there's nothing that is predictive in the reality that is unfolding in this moment? And I think it's very much what Francisco was talking about in terms of adaptivity, the capacity for adaptation, rapid but deep adaptation as reality is unfolding in our experience as individuals, as a society, and as a big ecology.
Wonderful. Thank you. I see that Andreas has some things.
Yeah, so it's turning out really interesting. So, I had this very short feeling about edges, that it was about joy, fear, and trepidation. And if I should add a few more words to that, then I think it might have something to do with the topology of an edge. I mean, it's something that it's not like a threshold that you can just stumble over. You can really fall out over the edge. And I think with that comes the fear and the trepidation. And if we stay with that metaphor, then, that sense of completely losing control as you fall over the edge, there is a sense of an edge being catastrophic, right? And in it being catastrophic means that there is a temporal dimension to it. You can't really go back. That's what catastrophes are like. Once it has happened, there is no turning back. Or at least if you turn back, it's not the same space as you were in before. A catastrophe is not a disaster necessarily. It can be, but it need not be. But I think that sense of the edge being catastrophic, to me, is what standing of the edge is about. That you are confronting this sense of that unknown that has catastrophic elements to it. Now, I thought, Joan, you brought in something really interesting, that in the pure topology of it, there is fear and trepidation. But if you add compassion in there, I guess part of the compassion is that you're not alone on the edge. And those others on the edge can both be behind you and in front of you. So it's almost as if part of what compassion might be doing, or part of what relations do in this sense, is that it creates some kind of a network of relations that allows one to actually move across this catastrophic moment that every edge is about. And that, I guess, can take away some of the fear and some of the trepidation from it. So I think if we live in edgy times, and if the edginess has to do with facing an edge is also facing a catastrophe, then realizing that you're not alone, and in a sense showing others that they are not alone either, might be one of the ways that we can actually live with and be with and act in a situation of edginess.
Thank you, Andreas.
Thanks, Andreas. Father Francis?
Yeah, this reminds me actually of an experience that might be illustrative and helpful. A number of years ago, really more than 20 years ago, I was at San Francisco State University, and I was assigned to bring back from the dead a Catholic student organization on the campus. And there was already an ecumenical group there that was running a house called The Edge. And it was on the edge of the campus where all of the transportation from the city of San Francisco arrived. And so it was a very good edge to be at. But when the students arrived, they were expected to undertake certain tasks to be able to live in that house. Now, this is an interesting example of what Andreas has just been pointing out. The people who organized the Edge thought that they were bringing people in to carry out a task. The people who came into the Edge were not ready to take on that task and were, in fact, petrified by what they had to face by doing the task, which was mostly social service projects in challenging neighborhoods in the city of San Francisco. So I sat down with the students who were quite literally petrified by what they had stepped into. And I said, well, what do you really, first of all, how do you feel? And of course, I feel terrified. My high school preparation was not adequate. I don't know what I'm doing. This is my first semester in university. I'm totally confused and frightened. And I said, all right, so let's look at that. Now, what do you think could diminish that? And as it turned out, of course, as the weeks went on, helping the students, listening to their problems, listening to the challenges they faced in the classroom, some of which are actually quite funny when you actually sat down with them and worked it through, like not being able to understand the foreign accent of the graduate teaching assistants, for example, and therefore not understanding how to discern knowns from unknowns in the chemistry class. All right, this was really kind of funny when we finally worked it out. But the point was that out of all of that experience, I realized that what I had provided was a context of listening, a context of allowing people to voice their concerns, which enabled them to enter the Edge, right? But now in a creative way, and in a way that actually built their confidence over the course of a semester. And I think that that's the kind of thing we have to do now. We have to figure out a way to turn the poisons that have been churned up into nectar, into something that gives people life. Brother David always spoke about listening as the basic spiritual practice. And I think that's kind of the thing that's opening up here in this conversation.
Turning poison to nectar, that's beautiful.
Yeah, maybe, just to add on to that, I want to harp back on the point that Joan already touched upon, which is asking, is there even an edge? What is the edge? Because I think very often we create a lot of edges where if we really investigate, you can't really find them. And a very clear example, I think, is like, what is the edge between me and outside me? And then if you think about it, like, I think about half of my cells are like bacteria and other organisms that live in me. And they are me and they're not me at the same time. And almost every edge that I can think of, if I really think clearly and thoroughly, then I cannot find it. So maybe also that's actually what Father Tiso was doing. Apart from listening, he was investigating with the student where the edge was, and by that investigation, dissolving it.
I think I'll just jump in here and say, yeah, that's wonderful, Marieke. Like, where are our edges? And I think part of what I really appreciated about Amy's comments at the beginning was, well, we need edges, because without edges, in a sense, we can't make meaning. But I think the word make is so key there, that we are making, we're not finding meaning objectively in the world, we're making meaning. and that there are aspects of what it means to be human, of the human mind body, which sort of makes edges even when there are no edges. And I actually, if you don't mind, I'm going to show you one image here, which is my favorite example of that, which is this, right? So I assume most of you probably see a triangle, but everyone knows there's no triangle there, or is there actually? And that's a really intriguing question, right? Is the triangle you see in the kinesis triangle, is that real or not? In what sense is it real? Well, phenomenologically, it's real, right? In other words, it appears in our mind. But if we try to, pick up that triangle or do something with that triangle, we won't be able to do that. And I think there's so much of right now in our world, part of what, of course, makes us anxious is that those aspects of our mind-body system that create edges, maybe especially social edges, that we become, which we just take as, reality, the differences between groups, between races, between political ideologies, whatever they might be, between countries, Ukraine and Russia and so on, that those edges, of course, we take simply seem objectively real to us. And in a sense, when they seem to start to fall apart or they become challenged, our ability to predict, to talk about predictive processing in the brain, for example, our ability to predict the future also starts to fall apart. And especially when we recognize the contingency of our own edges that we've made, we know that, I was working with a model of the world that turns out to not work, actually, right? So part of what I'm really intrigued with is, as we enter into this kind of maybe liminal phase, is the possibility for real change, like dramatic change, actually. Maybe one of the biggest changes we've had historically as humans is the emergence of large-scale societies, more than probably 12,000 years ago as they start to emerge. That emergence of large-scale societies required certain types of changes, beliefs, for example, in entities that unite all people so that we all feel like we're in the same group, even if we don't know each other, so we're all Danish or we're all this or we're all that. And that part of what I think we're facing now is that many of those transcendent entities that united us into groups are now really being called into question. And we are no longer confident in their reality, actually. And that makes us really nervous. But the flip side of that is that it also empowers us, that we can choose in a sense. Of course, it's going to be hard. You can actually learn to unsee that triangle, by the way. It's not easy, but you can learn to unsee that triangle. We can also learn to unsee some of the dysfunctional edges in our world, I think. And maybe a completely different world can emerge out of that.
John, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate what you're saying. I also want to just bring up another little territory, and that has to do with this term intersectionality, which is used to describe how we experience the race, how we experience class or gender, as well as social conditions. And it's an interesting term. It was coined by the Black feminist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And I think that, this term is fascinating for us right now because there is great resistance at this point to the binary. And of course, science is based very much on a binary perspective. And so whether it's talking about gender or class and race and so forth, I think what we're seeing at the level of what's rising from the unconscious psychosocially right now is resistance to the binary, resistance to this notion of a hard edge, and looking at the ecotone, if you will, this zone of junction or a transition area between two biomes or between binaries.
If I could jump in, a couple of things. So one thing that I was thinking was, if I was listening to this conversation and I was sitting in a camp in Calais, waiting to cross the channel, I'd be like, what do you mean it's all in the head? So there are ways in which the material realities in which we live, including also the nation state boundaries, are they have emerged maybe from ways of thinking about, ourselves and others and collectives and so on, but they become material realities. And so, triangles, we can learn to unthink. And I fully agree that the ways in which we categorize groups of people around the world or close to us can raise all sorts of problems, and we need to learn to unthink that. But there are certain material realities that I think, if we think about this being on the edge, forces us to look at and find these creative ways of thinking differently about our common condition, the ways in which we are related as individuals and collectively at a global scale. So I was just thinking that it's 50 years this year since the Club of Rome's report Limits to Growth came out, and which is an interesting anniversary. It's also very depressing. I teach courses on sustainability, and my students tend to get a little depressed because I always have them read the report, and what they notice is that, we knew this already in 1972. Why the hell hasn't anything been done about it? Because the kinds of scenarios that we're following are the worst case scenarios of the Club of Rome report in many instances. Now, at the same time, you could say, many people have been lifted out of poverty. Proportionally, things are going a little better in that sense, but global inequality has increased. While it's true that the questioning of binaries and very narrowly rigid understandings of race and so forth are being questioned, and more people are challenging these kinds of received ideas, at the same time, we see racism rearing its ugly head in the most horrible ways in many different places around the world. So we have these two countervailing tendencies, you could see. On the one hand, we have this potential and an understanding from biology, from cognitive science, from the contemplative traditions, to see things as they are, as this fluid, moving, forever changing, processual image of being. And at the same time, we have these countervailing tendencies where the edges are being sharpened and hardened, and people are getting ready for war. So one of the questions I would want to raise is, if we take the Victor Turner rites of passage perspective, so we were talking about being in this liminal state. If we take the work of the German sociologist Ulrich Beck, he's developed this idea about risk society, the way in which the current predicament, the fact that the world's crises are truly global and transcend national boundaries, in a way are a call for, global identifications of, transcending our national and particular interests. So if we look at this liminal phase, one of the things that's always striking about the liminal phase is that it creates very, very deep bonds between the people that are recognizing or going through this liminal phase, what Victor Turner called communitas. And so, in a way, we could ask ourselves, also if we take the image from Francisco's work with laying down a path in walking, which comes from a poem, what Roshi Joan said earlier about, finding the courage to, be without stable, what do you call it in English, things to hold on to. All these elements are in a way an invitation to enter a liminal, fully enter a liminal state and recognize our common predicament. And so the question is, how do we begin to work towards that? Because it requires a work out in the world and recognizing the hard boundaries that people are facing, coming up against. But also it requires this inner work to begin to see what's truly the case and how we are truly connected and in a shared predicament. Sorry, that ended up being a little long-winded.
Thank you, Martijn.
Just say one thing here, that I think the challenge is that to get to that liminal, to actually, in a sense, step across the edge is an act that for most people will involve fear. And what we know, for example, from terror management theory is that this sort of particular value, so if we say, groups have different values, different things that are important to them, that they consider sacred, that they consider disgusting, whatever it might be, but they don't seem contingent to those groups, right? So within those groups, let's say something like gay marriage, for example, for some groups, it's just abhorrent, right? For other groups, it's an expression of liberty. And those don't seem contingent. They seem objective. they simply are the case. And it's also part of the way in which those social groups identify each other. Even if they meet a stranger at a demonstration or what have you, they are participating in this larger reality that is, and largely structured by their values. And so what terror management theory has shown pretty convincingly, actually, is that when you start to prime people with the threat of death, they start to become more and more hardened in their values. So for example, one of the studies was conducted in Germany. I can't remember the name of the authors, but basically they did some interviewing in front of an innocuous place and then some other interviewing in front of a cemetery, and found that certain types of very German values became much more intensely obvious, and also actually animus toward immigrants also became more obvious when you interviewed subjects in front of a cemetery instead of in front of some other place. People weren't thinking about death overtly. And I think part of what we see now is the pandemic itself is kind of death is in the atmosphere. And that is part of what is causing us to collapse into our little worlds where we think we're safe.
Thanks, John. Andreas? You unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. So I guess it's very interesting with this shift in our discussion now from edges as being kind of an inside and an outside, into saying maybe it's not so interesting as the edges in the world or if it's in the mind, because the point is that it's for real, but it's also permeable, right? And I think what so much of the literature on rituals is about, and so much of the kind of research into social groups would be saying that whenever you find these kind of social edges and social boundaries, then there are always ways, so to say, to permeate, that they can become permeable, that there are processes that opens them up and shifts them about. And that once you actually begin to explore these ways in which edges are not just edges, you can both understand their edginess, but also how one can move back and forth between them. And it's precisely as you described, Martijn, in these processes that a lot of sense of cohesion and bonding is actually being created in either being initiated into how do you actually move from this space that seems to be an edge into another space, but also in the process of people moving in there. So it seems not so much to be a matter of whether it's for real or whether it's in your mind, but what are the processes that actually allows us to move back and forth between them, and how can we do them together? I think that's really where the discussion is standing now.
Well, you could say one of the big questions is, how do we gain a shared sense of direction, and where do we find the wisdom to find that sense of direction?
So, Martijn, thank you for particularly the latter phrase. How do you access the wisdom? I was going to actually ask John maybe to reflect on view in this regard. And also just coming back to the Keats perspective on, the poet Keats' perspective on negative capability. How do we have the wherewithal to actually be with uncertainty, to rest in not knowing, to access, if you will, the penetralium, this kind of inner space that is characterized by fundamental openness to things as they are, including what you're referencing, Martijn, which I think is really important, the environmental and social conditions that are characterized by incredible suffering that we are witness to, or the threat that we are all accessing right now in relation to Russia, the United States, other power bases in the Ukraine, knowing that literally Europe is standing at the edge of war. And that war that Europe is, that edge that Europe is standing on is actually not just Europe. It affects everything on this planet, just as the climate catastrophe does, just as this pandemic has. And it's to how do we develop the view that allows us to both see the power of uncertainty, the necessity of wisdom, as you were pointing to, Martijn, to like Keats was pointing to in the 1800s, of negative capability to rest in the mysterium, so to speak. At the same time, to have the resilience to sustain ourselves and to find the wisdom to go forward.
I would like to hear what others have to say on that. I mean, I think it's an important but very difficult question. The only thing I think I would just, in a sense, repeat what you said, Roshi, which is there is a kind of wisdom, which is the wisdom of not knowing. And that sense, of feeling safe in doubt. There's that poem, to cite another poet, Yeats, who speaks about, what is it again? The best lack all conviction and the worst are filled with passionate intensity, right? And that's, I think, not a bad, written in a place which really also felt like very much like an edge in the early 20th century, I'm sure, very edgy times, obviously. That, there is a way in which we have a real excess of conviction actually in the world. And that we need to let go, perhaps, of those certainties, and that will enable us to step across and to come together in some kind of unified vision that brings us together. One that maybe we even sort of acknowledge is something that we are deliberately putting together for ourselves, and not just kind of finding out there in the world. That might be, I don't know, maybe that's unrealistic, but I'd love to hear what others, Father Tiso or Martijn, whomever, have to say about this problem of where do we find that wisdom?
And I just want to make one more point before Martijn and Father Tiso jump in. And this has to do with certainty, the relationship between certainty and fundamentalism. So I just want to throw that into the mix. Which also, relates to something that several of you have said, how adversity bonds, but that bonding can be liberative, but it can also lead to a fundamental perspective, self and other.
Katrin, can we hear from you?
Yes. Well, maybe I will repeat some of the things that have been said, but one of the first ideas that comes to my mind when thinking about standing at the edge is really to get out of my comfort zone and let it go, as Martijn was just saying. And of course, when we're at the edge, it's being really at border limit of our knowledge of our culture, of our capacities and possibilities. And as it was said before, we're really encountering an unknown situation. And really getting out of my comfort zone is to let it go and lose control. So fear is really there. And the question is, what might happen if I'm losing control and let it go? What can I learn? What is the fear, and what is the issue, the challenge, and what I'm facing? And to go back to what Roshi Joan was saying, all this pandemic, loss of biodiversity, climate change, sorts of fear, denial, stress, anger, but also we can see that some people are really facing those issues, and it can generate solidarity, creativity, awareness of interdependence. And for example, Fridays for Future that was launched by Greta Thunberg. It's really an example of young people really facing the issue and having a lot of solidarity and a lot of initiatives and creativity also. So I think this, of course, is very it's very strong right now. What we're facing in the field of environmental issues, and especially the climate change. And I guess in Europe or in the States, we're not facing the more stressful thing of the climate change. We might go towards this, but right now, some other people, some other countries are really facing really hard stress from this. So I just wanted to point out that creativity and imagination can be really there to help us to get out of this edge, or to walk on this edge.
Thanks, Katrin. Father Francis, did you want to add something?
Yes, this is actually brings us back to Mind in Life in some ways, because what are we here for, kind of thing. Our continual self-criticism and self-reflection on the role of Mind in Life in the future of humanity. And certainly one of the areas that, of course, I referred already to students. I've been reading a few things. Giacomella Orofino and I had a dialogue on the radio a couple of weeks ago about the end of an era in Tibet, and some of the very interesting figures, especially in Eastern Tibet, who were contending and coping with that change. And one of the things, of course, came up was the whole question of the tulku system and the training of young monks and young leaders. And I'm also reading a biography of Rudolf Nureyev, and getting a feel for the world of, under Soviet communism, the training of young, talented people, in this case for Marieke's great work of the ballet. And it's very interesting to see the intensity of the attention that is given to young people who show promise. And even with all of the challenges and difficulties of personality conflicts and everything else that existed in both the Tibetan system and in the ballet world of Russia, we see the emergence of remarkable human qualities within and in part facilitated by really rigorous training. And I go back to my own relatively brief experience as a science nerd back in the 1960s, a similar experience where high school students from the New York area were brought together. I think John Dunn knows this area very well, over in Yonkers, New York, to study at the Boyce Thompson Institute for Plant Research. And what a powerful experience it was to spend time together with other young people passionate about science and to be trained rigorously in the methods of biochemistry. At the age of 16, to have that exposure and to engage a community of science. I think one of the things that fascinates Misha Bitbal, and one of the things we talk about a lot, is this quality. What is it that makes a scientist? What is the inner life of a scientist, of a researcher? All of these things begin to open out a road in front of us where we can see a very powerful role for the mentoring identity of our association. We can be mentoring people and bringing about the excitement that makes possible inner transformation, even as people are rigorously trained. I want to propose that for as you might say, next step in this conversation kind of thing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Father Francis, for moving us ahead, and also for bringing us sort of into the context of what we're doing at Mind and Life, because as you all know very well, we do have a card for it. And on the back it says, dare to welcome the unknown with open mind, expect surprises, which was one of Francisco's favorite little syntagms, let's say. And there's a quote, and it's the only card that doesn't actually have a quote from Francisco. It has a quote from Sakni Rinpoche, who says, interdisciplinary work is the best antidote for the arrogant ego, which was something that we liked a lot. So I'm I'm going to move us into questions 3 and 4, but I see that, Andreas, would you like to say something? With that?
No, that was just closing off the other discussion, but Amy, if you want to move ahead, then by all means, let's do that.
I'm sure that we will be going back around, and already with these quotes, we're going back around because all of these, the constellation of concepts are all linked. But I wanted to show this card to bring us back into the notion of interdisciplinary work as working the edges, right? And so so as we get together and as we're doing here, I see the little squares with the edges between them. But in Mind and Life, where we have a number of different domains of work and research represented, we realize that each person has a privileged point of access to reality. Each domain, you could say, I don't know if you'd agree, Father Francis, but you could say each scientific or domain in social sciences and humanities, each has its own kind of ritual order and its own kind of access to its own kind of reality and different edges, depending on the type of training one has. So this is a kind of a bipartite question or topic that I'd like to shift us to, which is how can we apply, maybe we could start from each one of your particular perspectives, how can we apply our different disciplinary lenses to these particular times that we're living? How do you do it? How do you feel that you're doing it from within your discipline? And then the second part of the question is inspired by a lot of recent work we've been doing at Mind and Life Europe around the notion of, particularly in the summer institutes, into the question of what is knowledge and how do knowledge and action articulate? What does it mean to know something? What does it mean to put that into action? And in 2022, we'll be looking at these questions again at the Summer Institute with a focus on intersubjective relations and in particular knowledge transmission, which is clearly one way in which knowledge and action articulate through the transmission of knowledge. And so the question there would be, how can the theoretical work that we do from our individual disciplinary lens perspective make for a better world in a very pragmatic or practical sense? So big questions. How do you apply your lens and how do you feel about its application in the practical world? Father Francis, you're unmuted, so.
Yeah, just to go back to where I was just taking off from, this whole, practically my entire world of service has been to try to educate people, bring people to their own inner fulfillment through helping them recognize their gifts, what they have. What's the charism? What's the special trait? What's the passion? And awaken that passion. This morning I had a young man here who I thought was going to be here for about a half hour, but it ended up being 2.5 hours doing just that. He's interested in naturopathy. He's been doing a lot of work with Bach flower remedies and other things like that. And he's very young and is really blossoming beautifully as he goes through that. And it's kind of one-on-one, kind of mentoring people to encourage them. I think as Mind and Life, we do work with young scientists. Maybe we need to work with younger scientists. Maybe we need to be looking at the world and winnowing it and bringing it into a threshing floor where there's a concentration of energy so that across various scientific and philosophical disciplines, there's a kind of new community of discourse that will emerge. I'm seeing this certainly in a book, this new edition of The Embodied Mind, for example, that I just got today. Came in very nicely. There are a lot of proposals for a kind of community of discourse that could really happen and open up something so that a person like myself with a Christian contemplative orientation and a knowledge of Buddhism, a knowledge of science, brings that area into conversation with people whose passions could be philosophy or even music, the arts and so forth, and create a community of discourse where people really do feel welcome and yet at the same time able to negotiate edges, right? And able to negotiate the places of fear, anxiety. I don't agree with the way you say things. I don't understand the way you're articulating your ideas, and to find a new way to the anthropological flow of human community and human discourse, and therefore the transmission of knowledge in more than a simply linear one-to-one, discipline-to-discipline kind of model. Though clearly interdisciplinary means willing to listen to people who don't really like your discipline, or not attracted, or not passionate about your discipline, and getting them to understand why you are passionate about that, and beginning to share vocabulary, experiences, and eventually projects.
Right. You're right about, I agree with you completely about interdisciplinarity, but I also think that it's one area in which mastery or specialization do give us a very particular kind of sense of power.
Yeah.
It's very hard to give up. It's
Yes.
very hard to. Katrin?
Yes, Amy, you spoke about two things. I mean, theory and practice for a better world. So one of my questions is what is a better world? I mean, for whom? Because what do we want to enhance or reduce or increase or add to our world? And maybe your better world is not mine and is not the one of my neighbor. So I think it's a very wide question, and I have no answer. I have only questions about this. But I just wanted to share something with you about interdisciplinary approach that could help for a better world, whatever it is. And have been using a metaphor when working with the scientists from different disciplines in sustainable development issues and environmental issues. I've been using this metaphor of a mountain, which is really the topic of the research. And there are a lot of villages around these mountains, and villages are disciplines. And of course, when you're living at the south part of a mountain, you see only one side. You know it very well.
Mm-hmm.
If you live at the north side, you see another side of it. And of course, when you discuss with the people living in those different villages, they know quite well the landscape in front of their house, but it's not complete. And in a way, you have to take some hike and maybe stay sometimes in the villages and discuss with the people. And so this is a metaphor to show that we may know a lot of things about one topic or knowledge or whatever, but then some people somewhere else know a lot also, and we can learn from each other. And going back to what we're facing right now, I'm quite amazed for 2 years now that a very, very small, tiny little virus, which is, for some biologists, it's a living thing, but for some it's not living. But whatever it is, living or not, our planet, our life are just different from 2 years now. And what does it mean? What does it mean for a philosopher, for sociologists, for politicians? These little things which is really changing, disturbing, putting some edges. So this is really what is a better world? I mean, maybe this little thing is helping us to find another better world. I don't know.
Thank you, Katrin. Marieke?
Yeah, the image that just keeps popping into my head that I feel like I have to share here is one that's used by Trungpa Rinpoche to explain something about Vajrayana and groundlessness, and that's the idea that you're jumping off a plane without a parachute. That's the bad news, but the good news is that there's no grounds. And I think that that's a very beautiful image to sort of to deal with the fear. I think that was part of the question. That's why it came up. And I think also there's a lot in terms of teaching students to create this environment where there is no ground. So you can feel safe to fall and it's fine. And you're teaching them how to fall and how to explore this other side. And maybe there's another side. And I think especially in terms of interdisciplinary research, I find that I do that a lot when I'm working with colleagues from different disciplines, and we're I give this perspective and they get that perspective, and the student sort of has to figure out how to navigate all these hurdles, and it's hard, but we're all of us are learning in the process, and maybe beyond the learning about that particular topic, we're also learning how to handle that situation where there is no ground because there's just all these different perspectives. And they are, of course, very real. And I'm also not saying that it's easy because, for example, then when you try to publish it, do you publish it in the clinical psychology journal or in the cognitive science journal? And it doesn't quite fit in either. And so there is a reality there that you do have to handle. But at the same time, if you have a little bit of that freedom of knowing that there is no ground so we can play is very helpful. And I think maybe especially now I notice that students especially find it more difficult to find a space to play. They always feel they need to give the right answer. But there is no right answer. There is no ground.
Martijn, you've got your hand up.
Yeah. When you asked the question about how do we look at this from our disciplinary perspectives, I thought that's an unfortunate question to a group of people who all think and work so interdisciplinarily as we are. That's one of the things that attracted us to Mind and Life. Yeah. But I also, like Marieke immediately and Father Francis, started thinking about working with students. Like Katrin said earlier, imagination, creativity. I mean, youth they have to live under these conditions for much longer than most of us. And so, really, we need to think about what it is that we can do for the next generation, or the generation that is coming of age now, that are in the universities and public schools. And of course, Mind and Life Europe has had for quite some time a contemplative education initiative. And I think that's really where part of our attention needs to be continuously. I think when we think about some of the things we were talking about earlier, so the high modernist idea about the world is that we can figure it out and then we will know what to do, sort of an engineering approach. Mm-hmm. I think the wiser approach is to practice humility and lower the volume on the hubris and listen a little more and know that our models are inadequate. So that what we really need to give people help with is learning to trust that it is okay to, try and pay attention to what is going on inside yourself before you rush out and give the right answer, or you make a drawing for how the bridge can be built and so on. So some of these very, very basic tools, like getting in proper contact with your body, regardless of what's going on around you, is always going to be helpful. And our whole way of living, certainly in the rich part of the world, but it's spreading globally, is that we're always distracted by gadgets that are, appealing to our vision and our desires, and feeding us with information and drawing us away from where we are at any particular time. So just this very basic sense of grounding in the body, I think, is really important. The other thing that's really important is helping people to begin to listen more deeply to what we might call their deepest sense of values, of who they are, of what they are. And if we can help them with that, then they'll have a kind of anchor from which they can see maybe a little bit more clearly the situation around them, recognize the edges for what they are, find opportunities to work with them in a more creative fashion. And so for me, it's really, in the end, a matter of, where Mind and Life Europe can make a real difference is by, in all that we're doing, having this, at least some of our focus on this contemplative work, the inner work that young people in particular should be given some tools for and opportunities to practice, because I think that's what is needed for us to stop feeling overwhelmed by the challenges that we're facing in our individual lives and collectively.
Thanks, Martijn. Joan.
I want to just go to back to something that Katrin mentioned and several of you have referenced, and that is the role of imagination in what we're doing, and how, the tendency in science, of course, is to grovel before facts, if you will. And as a result of that, science is so divided from the arts. And I recently read a really wonderful article in The Atlantic by Rebecca Solnit that was about Virginia Woolf. And I just pulled a sentence out of it that I really appreciated. She says, ultimately, the destruction of the earth is due in part, perhaps in large part, to a failure of the imagination, or to its eclipse by systems of accounting that can't count what matters. And I feel, understanding how Mind and Life, which has a very strong neurocentric or science orientation, can also open itself, to not just groveling before facts, so to speak, but to the role of imagination in terms of the future that we will shape together. Or what Francisco so appreciated was adaptivity and surprise.
John?
I think in some ways, Roshi has just kind of, in a way, said what I was thinking about, but I'll articulate it a little differently, which is, my kind of home base in some ways is Buddhist philosophy, especially of the Dharmakirti epistemological style. And in that context, there are constraints on our knowledge. So I can't just say, given the way we use the words pen and flower, those concepts, I can't say that's a flower. I'm just not going to work. If I want to do something with it, I can't say that. So, and why is that? Because there are constraints. But what I call this, a cylinder, a black object, a pen, nyugu in Tibetan, whatever terms I have, there's nothing that forces me to call it anything in particular. I can have, so the idea in the Dharmakirtian realm is our conceptual systems are not given with reality. There are constraints on those systems. We could call external constraints. Actually, some of them are internal. But those systems, nevertheless, are in a sense constructed. And the way they're constructed, and I think something that we've all been kind of talking about just recently here, is based upon what we value, what our goals are, what we think is important. So I think two things that come out of that are, first of all, being very clear in a reflective and reflexive way about values. For Mind and Life, I think this is so important. Like, not just our explicit values, but actually our implicit ones. Like Katrin's statement is so important. Sorry about that. Who better for whom? For whom is this better? That's an incredibly important statement. That's actually a statement about inquiry into our values. And then the other feature here that we find as we have a capacity, like right here on Zoom, to in a sense connect with people who share our values more and more, to create these kinds of new types of communities, actually, which maybe are going to, in some sense, be the wave of the future. At the same time, the problem with these communities, which we see in social media, is they can become completely divorced from actual application, right? Yeah. So that, and then the best example of this is conspiracy theories, where people can come up with all kinds of conspiracy theories. And the reason they can hold those theories is they're not tested, right? They don't actually try to do something with them. They simply operate in a fantasy world where those theories are the truth. So that I think is so important, that on the one hand, we be very conscious of our values, and on the other hand, that we really try to apply, we have knowledge systems, we know we're creating them, and that we really in very concrete ways try to apply, check, even maybe I'm making a call for the importance of empiricism, that we really check in our own experience. For example, if we do the kind of practice Martijn's talking about, does it change my experience? What happens when I do that?
Andreas?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. This is a really interesting question that you're raising. And I think for many of us, the last couple of years of pandemic experience has been almost also like a golden time as a researcher, because there has been so much to try to explore with others. There's been so many unknown situations where, in a sense, you could do something not just by developing vaccines or other things, but simply also trying to be part of making sense of the situation we were all in, a situation that was novel to everyone, and where everyone, in a sense, became, COVID-19 experts overnight, no matter whether we were biologists or not, because, in a sense, that situation was so radically novel. And I think that the discovery I had, and I think many others also had, is that, you could help make sense of this, but not on your own, only by teaming up with other people, be they researchers or be they others, in trying to create these kind of spaces for understanding and acting collectively in that complex situation we're in. And I can add just kind of a few things from our own research. So one of the initiatives we did, and I'll post a link in the chat, was a website where we asked people to share pandemic experiences from across the world. And they were all constructed along, they all started out by the sentence, I used to, or we used to, and then now I, or now we, something else. And what we found very interestingly was that when we just looked at the fraction of people who would be choosing an I or a we as a starting point, then that tracked quite carefully the severity of the pandemic. So in those times when the pandemic was biting very harsh, many more people felt it naturally to talk in sense of a we rather than an I. And as the pandemic would be, so to say, losing its grip again, it would shift back to an I again. So, kind of a very interesting way in which these shared external phenomenon has something to do with our sense of identity. Currently, we're trying to make sense of, in a sense, map out this experiential landscape that we can see through these sentences. And we're doing this, among others, with people from literary studies. And it's not so much people who have kind of first or second-hand experience with COVID-19 or death or strong senses of disease in the family, but it's all the rest of us, where in a sense the COVID-19 was a backdrop from a radical kind of transformation of how life was being lived. And I will just share my screen to kind of share one of the key metaphors that my colleague has come up with. This is Katrin, who is a German researcher. And she said that when we kind of look at the topology of what does it look like to be inside of this pandemic world, then it looks like what the French call a saut de loup or a ha-ha, which is a landscape feature where in a sense you're inside a wooded meadow and then there is a steep edge basically. And then it continues on the other side. But from inside that meadow, you know that you can't get out, but you cannot really see what blocks it from getting out. And currently it seems like a lot of that pandemic experience is not to be, so to say, surrounded by a wall or surrounded by a strong boundary, but it's really the experience of being inside this this kind of immediate cliff that just doesn't block your view, but blocks your ability to see. And if that is kind of a collective experience that a lot of us have had, of being together inside of that space, that there is an outside, but we can't get out there, I think that experience is one that we will carry with us, and it's going to be extremely interesting to see whether that might also lead to possibilities for some kind of collective change and a collective realization of the situation we are in.
Thank you, Andreas. Is there anyone else, anyone who would like to contribute something to this question? The next question that we have is very much linked, and in fact, we've kind of already entered it. But the final topic or question that we wanted to ask all of you was about work that Mind and Life Europe could do in the coming year to better work the edges. Both in terms of our interdisciplinary work and in terms of our organization as a discursive community, to use some of your words. And we were wondering if you had some questions, if you had some ideas about questions we should be asking ourselves in order to explore in a deep kind of way, in a deeper kind of way, in a way that's more adapted to the urgency of the times, the question of what is contemplative science.
So Amy, Martijn, you go.
I was just thinking that contemplative science, I always have this question that comes up immediately, which is, do we mean the science of contemplation, or do we mean contemplation as a form of science? And of course, ideally, we would like to be equal partners, but I think the shift has, or the bias has been on the science side. And I think we need to shift that back.
So Amy, I think that one of the, I'm really glad you're asking this question, because it would be very easy and safe to sit in the bubble of the mission, so to speak. And of course, I've forgotten specifically what the mission is. You know, probably there's a good mission statement on the website, but
that's
I'm always
bubbles. That's the proper bubbles. They don't have edges, so we don't know what we're doing in them.
Right. So, you know, I think it's, you know, how willing is the community of Mind and Life to actually engage in walking into territories that are where you lay down a path in walking, to quote Francisco's wonderful translation. What kind of risks are you, what kind of risk are we willing to take? It's like the biologist who, you know, walks on a trail every day and sees deeper and deeper into the species, you know, of a particular biome. But when he steps or she steps off the trail, it's a whole other world. And are we open to looking, you know, off trail, so to speak, going off trail, and working with the experience, you know, of imagination, so to speak, of surprise, and is the organization nimble enough, pliable enough to break out of its bubble of, quotes, contemplative science, in the sort of narrow sense of the word, to, you know, open up to biomes that have not been familiar to us. And then something that both was pointed out in social media and also in the chat stream, what I see are the faces of 9 people on the screen where we share a common race and a common culture. And I don't see the diversity in our composition. And are we able to actually, you know, sort of break out of the bubble of this composition into an ecology, a psychosocial ecology that is richer and more complex?
Wonderful, thank you. Well taken, Joan. Katrin?
Yes, I want to jump because I was going to say something very similar and working more specifically with S3. I guess it's a privilege and place and time where interdisciplinary dialogue can take place and can be enhanced and supported. And I think, Amy, you were speaking about more rubbing, you know, to stimulate the dialogue, and that could be achieved by accepting more diversity. I think it's really the word I wanted to say, and this goes with what Roshi Joan was just saying. And this diversity can come from different disciplines, tradition, but also different points of view in the same discipline. And I agree, we're really standing at the edge could be to look outside of the MLE community where we share those values, but I mean, values can be also shared by some other people out of the community. And I think it's a very, there is quite easily, we can find a consensus. And I think we should have more diversity to have more confrontation and more discussion about maybe our certainty and being more in an uncertainty state and really look outside for more diversity. Yeah, and I think it could be source of dynamic and creativity also.
Yeah, so I would like to follow up on that, if that's okay. I would really hope that MLE would be a place where we can together create a place where we can all feel safe to play and to go to draw outside our outside the lines, and so that we can really stand at edges. And at the same time, I would actually disagree a little bit with Martijn to have a bit more science and really try to see whether we can stretch the science. For example, I think this topic of the question of whether contemplative practices can help us see things from many different perspectives. Can we actually empirically test that? I would love to figure out a way to do that, because I think it is a really important question these days. So maybe we can, but we need to safe playing ground to be able to think creatively enough to figure it out, I think.
Marieke, I'd love to ask you what you mean by safe.
I think what I mean is that a place where you feel you can make mistakes, you can fall down many times, and that you'll be able to get up again. Maybe it's a bit similar to the idea of, you know, we're falling, but there's no ground, so we can be okay.
Well, safe can refer to view, but it also can be, I've seen how it operates to actually limit imagination and possibility. And, you know, that's why the bubble metaphor is so apt here. I think that actually I'm more interested in being in landscapes that aren't safe, that are unknown, that are pathless. But that's just my proclivity.
Yeah, and actually, I think what I mean by safe is actually one where we dare to explore such an unsafe place because we feel fundamentally safe. Maybe it's somehow that's the weird contradiction, I think.
But it implies that the community of discourse is big enough, all right, to be able to deal with all of that, with all the possibilities, including falling. And is not necessarily attached to a particular methodologies and ways of interpretation, that there may be other ways of doing that. So one of the areas where our cutting edge could be very, very challenging and very edgy would simply be what I've been saying recently in a number of our meetings, to look very carefully what we mean by contemplation and contemplative. Because there we find enormous diversity across cultures in the phenomenology of contemplation, contemplative, etc. And I don't think we've really fully exhausted that. In fact, I was very pleased to see in the both in Dan Goleman and Richie Davidson's new edition of their book and the new edition of The Embodied Mind, an admission of the fact that in a way there's a kind of modern Buddhism that has become the object of our study, which is the Buddhism of the scientists, all right? The Buddhism of also some reformers within the Buddhist world. But that's not really the full extent of the boundaries of contemplation or contemplative experience at all. And in fact, it even raises some very interesting questions about Buddhist history and the continuities within Buddhism, which are very, very rich. Not to mention, of course, the Christian contemplative tradition, the archaic religions that express their contemplative impulse through rhythm and dance and poetry and mythology, and so many other things that could be brought into the conversation very, very persuasively and enrich the conversation immensely. At the same time, I'm kind of a defender also of within the science end of contemplative science of in wanting to encourage people to feel comfortable about exploring basic science without having to explain themselves in terms of applications. You know, like, well, how does it really work? How does it really work? And if it's different in different cultures. And if it's the same in different cultures, that's interesting too. But really to do the basic work of how the brain works, how cells work. I've been watching Michael Levy. I don't know if Michael Levy is an edgy scientist or not, but certainly some of the things he's saying about electromagnetic gradients in the formation of organs are very directly related to the research that could be done on the basic science of meditation practice and other forms of contemplation as well. So I think there are some avenues here that are wide open and really would invite young and diversified talent.
I would like to thank Joan, maybe, and then we would turn to some questions from the audience as well.
Sure, I'll be very brief. I just want to say, I think one underlying theme is the issue of bias. And I think that's part of what I heard in a number of different comments. And I think one bias is, of course, just the implicit bias that we talk about in social psychology, right? So what kinds of biases are preventing us from being more diverse as a community that we are not even aware of? And then the second kind of bias that I think is really important for Mind and Life is really bias around contemplation itself. So for example, would we accept the idea that actually the contemplative at times could be actually destructive? And I don't mean negative side effects of meditation. I mean where you can harness contemplative practices for nefarious purposes. Is that possible? What are our biases about the first person, for example? I think those issues, I think we're pretty good at raising some questions about the biases of science. I'm not so sure we're good at raising questions about the biases of the first person. So those would be, I think, like just the issue of bias itself in all those different dimensions might be something to explore. What are our biases?
Thank you very much. This is fascinating, and we have collected lots of good questions and ideas from you during the discussion, but we are also collecting great questions, comments, even suggestions from our friends who are here with us today. So I would like to turn to some of their questions and some of their contributions. And I would like to ask Alain Theo first, if you can share your question with the panel, and then invite whoever would like to share some of their questions or thoughts or comments to raise their hand with the raise hand button. It's going to be easier for me to follow who would like to speak at this stage in the discussion. Thank you. So LA, maybe.
Thank you so much, Gabor, and thank you so much to all of you for familiar faces and you for such a fantastic spirit. Amy, I picked up from your comment very early on about edges being ubiquitous, and I really thought deeply about that. And my question was just reflecting my own personal experience as a coach, where I'm encountering resistance and edges all the time. And I was wondering if one of the key challenges of being edge beings living together is that we have different experiences of what that edge is. And I find that that's extra complicated because, like John said, some of these edges can be illusory and of the mind. But also, those tend to be the hardest ones too, because it's not a neutral thing. There's an intrinsic motivation, I find in my experience, to actually hold on to those edges because they create that sense of safety. And in fact, I have found to my experience that when I want to invite more of that loosening and the relaxing and that productive expansion, I often sometimes find the opposite happens with the people I'm speaking to. They hold on even more to our edges. And I think in the likely spirit, the worthwhile spirit of taking this theoretical work and translating it into application in the real world, I wanted to raise this for general consideration because it is one I encounter on a daily basis as a mom, as a civic member of society, and in my profession as well. There was also a quote from Maslow, which relates to what Roshi Joan was saying just now about safety, and was talking to Mariake about safety. And Maslow's quote says, at any given moment, we have two options: to step backwards into safety or to step forwards into growth. And I love that quote in that it's value neutral. It doesn't say, if safety is better or if growth is better, but it really does place that presence right in the square part of the picture. So my challenge is just to reflect some of these things, some of the difficulties of people drawing edges differently, some of these edges being intrinsic and extrinsic, and just wanted to share those thoughts for general discussion and adding on.
Thank you very much, Elaine. I understand your position a little bit, or what you've been saying about edges, because I too work with people pretty much on a daily basis. And it seems to be very clear that it would be another big discussion, but people cling to edges because leaving the edge behind would require a work of mourning that people aren't necessarily ready to do. And that's what I think people also imagine when they think about safety. It's a place where they have the illusion that there's no loss and there's no death and that there's no uncertainty. And so, yes, those are the things that we work with every day, and we also work with them with our kids. So the other thing that you, but also what Katrin and Mariake, you all been saying makes me think of is that even if we ultimately want to get to simplicity, we have to make a path into complexity and looking at all of the possible ways that these concepts or these ideas, like the edge, like the better world, like safety, can be drawn out from different perspectives and talked about, and dare to complexify before we look for a more peaceful place. That seems to be where you're pointing to a bit as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Amy. Anyone commenting on Elaine's question still from the panel? If not, then I would invite Annie Block. You also posted some notes in the chat, some questions, some points.
Yes, 2 points. First one on safety. I find this too homogeneous for me. On safety, a lot is being done theoretically and practically on safety, from the polyvagal theory, from all the work being done right now on traumas. I mean, it's not just a concept. So it's worth looking to that. But more importantly, I think the panel was mostly about concept, theories, principles. How about tools? And there are tools and there are methods. We talk about creativity. For instance, do you know that there's a method called thinking at the edge, which was developed by Eugene Gendling, we also developed what we call now microphenomenology. Thinking at the edge is a method to work at the edge, to develop creativity. It's really very important, very effective. And there's also, I know two other fields which I could talk about, which have some tools. But even then, just being bilingual is a practice at the edge. Because if you have already the simplest, having two sets of references is speaking two languages. You don't even have to travel. Even that, it's stereotype. You work simply at the edge. You see differences. Already that is a practice at the edge. It means if you have two sets of reference, already you are at the edge. And interdisciplinary is one way, but it's less accessible. There are more accessible ways to work at the edges. It's very important to develop skills to work at the edge. That's it.
Thank you, Annie, for both your comments. Who would like to respond or add anything to what Annie shared?
I'd just like to add that we do, Annie, have a strong link with the Genlin Thinking at the Edge people, and we've welcomed to our board Donata Schuler, who has a whole
I know
a whole school of critical thinking.
I know that I know that you know that, but I felt it was very important to mention that today in this panel.
Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, Donata Schuler is here with us.
Yeah, wonderful.
In the community. Yeah. Anyone else commenting, responding to Annie? Then I would invite Wolfgang Lucas.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask, because John, you mentioned sometime in the beginning that it's possible to unsee this triangle and maybe other edges, and I would think also perhaps perceived conflicts in or outer conflicts in a similar way, perhaps. And so I was wondering if that might have something to do with the gesture of relaxing into this edge, a little bit like Roshi John said also in the beginning at some point, like the willingness to rest in this intermediate territory. And is there a certain kind of practice beyond, or is it just that gesture itself, or is there some practice that can support whenever it feels important or meaningful yet difficult to transcend the edge, that such a gesture can be made? What would the gesture be? Do you have any recommendations or insights on this?
I think you'll be surprised by this answer, Wolfgang. But so I'm going to put up the kinesitron. I've actually written a paper about this, and I'll send it to you. So these figures, the black figures, actually in the literature are now called Pac-Man, based on the old game. So the triangle is much older than that, but the scientific literature actually refers to them as Pac-Man. And if you're familiar with that game, especially, one way to make sure that this works is play a bunch of Pac-Man for an hour or two, and then look at the figure and say to yourself, stare intently and say, Pac-Man, 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 Pac-Man. And I invite you to do this at home. And for about, it seems like about 50% of the people anecdotally who you do this on, the triangle disappears. So part of what that actually is, so there are kind of two versions, interestingly, in the sort of epistemological account of how we change our conception, our models. One of them is that you deliberately immerse yourself in an alternative model. And that's what you're doing there, is you're in a sense overriding one model, which is making you see the contours, what's called a contour illusion, right? and you're using a deliberate conceptual system to override that. And it can work, but it doesn't last very long, right? The other model is, sort of the relaxing of your, in a sense, of your priors, if you like, but with something that is so deep in our system, it's not, that relaxation doesn't seem to work very well. It seems to be very difficult to get to that point where you just let go of whatever is structuring your experience. And here I'd refer to Slavoj Žižek, who has this, he's in this film, The Pervert's Guide to Ideology. I don't agree with everything in there, but there are some really great things, especially the beginning, which is about, it's a whole scene about ideology. He draws on this campy sci-fi film by John Carpenter in the 80s, where this drifter finds these glasses, and when he puts the glasses on, he sees, the billboard that says, take a vacation, it actually says reproduce. And when someone hands him money and he puts the glasses on, it says, this is your God. And it turns out it's all about an alien invasion and, all this stuff. But the point is, it's not ideology. It's not like taking your glasses off. Ideology is your eyes. So you actually have to, in a sense, one way of thinking about this is what you want to have practices that actually really immerse us in an alternative model, right? Not just letting go, but actually actively adopting a different perspective. And I think that's very powerful because, I think it may be very naive to think, in my case at least, that I can do that kind of just letting go meditation in such a way that really all of those structures, all of those priors, whatever you want to call them, model that ideology simply disappears.
John, thank you. I think that's one path. Another is the one that you're suggesting is maybe not so helpful, but actually I think is very interesting to explore. And that is, what is it to actually identify your biases, to make conscious, if you will, your unconscious biases to the extent that one is able, and to come from a place that is fundamentally very open, without knowing or judgment and without the biases engaged. Suzuki Roshi talks about this in terms of beginner's mind, and Glassman Roshi, not knowing, and Vimalakirti, a tolerance for the inconceivable. What is it to, and we have, if you will, contemplative technologies that allow us to drop through the landscape of priors and into potentially a place that is basically open to things as they are. We've just finished this, or near the completion of this practice period, and looking at thusness, what is it to be in a space of tatata, of thusness, of being, able to perceive things just as they are, without the biases shaping our perception. And out of this, and what Michel Beatball writes, and what Bernie talks about in terms of bearing witness, which is not separating from things as they are.
Just to be clear, Roshi, I'm not saying my view is we need both. It's good to do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Wolfgang, for the question. Donata Scholler, whom I refer to, is also raising her hand. So Donata, please.
Well, first of all, for this really exciting conversation, which I really appreciated a lot. And I just want to Annie Bloch's indication to thinking at the edge. And of course, standing on the edge and thinking at the edge there's a great relevance between standing at the edge and thinking at the edge. And I think thinking at the edge is very much a liminal practice, to use this word, because we try, when we work, and we have a summer school, we had a summer school in Iceland this year where scientists from different disciplines were there. Marieke was also there. We really try to bring in the methods of sensing the body, of slowing down, of deep listening into scientific practice. And this is really a very, very exciting space. It's a deeply gratifying space. At the beginning, it is very challenging and it almost seems frightening to some. But when the researchers and scholars and students dare to do these simple steps, they have experiences as if they would really think for themselves the first time, and they can kind of experience an ownership of concepts and questions, and they kind of gain their own voice. Yes, so that is really a method, a very lovely, edgy method. Just say so much.
Thank you very much, Donata. And I would like to thank everyone. We might have missed some points from the chat or some questions from the chat. I see no one else raising their hand or his or her hand at this point. So I think we can maybe conclude on this quite edgy note that we have got good points, questions, feedbacks, even critiques, which are important to go forward and to explore some of them further in the coming events, activities of Mind and Life Europe this year and beyond. Thank you so much. Thank you, all the panelists or friends at MLE who have shared their knowledge, their intuition, their feelings, their stories with us. I would also like to thank everyone, all the participants, all our friends from various communities, MLE friends and others who have joined us today to explore this theme, question, what standing at the edge means. And we will continue exploring it this year and beyond. So Amy, if you want to share any final thought, or any of you in the panel, please feel free to do so now.
I'd like to invite anyone who would like to make a final comment to make one. I'm really stimulated by the intensity and this dialogue and the number of subjects that we've been able to cover in a way that hasn't been superficial, but that needs a lot of deepening. And I'm very grateful for all of the input that everyone has had, because I think that this kind of dialogue, this kind of listening, this kind of will be what we can use will be helpful for us during the whole year of our work together, to keep our minds in the right places and facing up into complexity in the way that we should. So thank you very much. Katrin, do you have a comment?
Yes, I like the drawing of the haha attitude, and I think I will bring that to my home, which is very close actually. And I think to look outside and cultivate humility by listening what is going on the other side.
Anyone else? Final word?
Well, maybe we are standing at the edge right now.
We are.
And, there's a landscape where there's a sense of familiarity and safety, but also there's a landscape which is new for us. And I hope that we have the courage in this next phase of Mind and Life Europe to actually take the necessary risks in order to activate the imagination so we can lay down a path in walking.
Thank you so much, Roshi. I think this is a good end note for us in this meeting and a good invitation to continue exploring these questions. Thank you. Thank you all once again. And let's see each other in other contexts, in other meetings, in other events this year. We are going to continue exploring these topics. This was just the beginning. Thank you all.
Thank you.